Hello to everyone. My name is Manuel Bardies, and I'm going to give the second of a series of lecture on radiopharmaceutical dosimetry. I'm from Institut de Recherche en Cancérologie de Montpellier, France, and this was prepared under the IAEA Technical Cooperation Program, and this is a project POL 9025. So this is the second lecture on radiopharmaceutical dosimetry, and this is on model-based dosimetry in nuclear medicine. As a reminder, nuclear medicine is a 90% diagnostic specialty, meaning that we are mostly interested in stochastic effects, and so this is what diagnostic dosimetry is concerned with. So diagnostic dosimetry should be performed for every new pharmaceutical before it's put on the market to document the irradiation delivered during the procedure, and that is needed before FDA or EMA approval. And usually diagnostic dosimetry in nuclear medicine is following the recommendation of the ICRP, ICRP being the International Commission on Radiological Protection. So this is what the ICRP is actually doing. ICRP is not a regulatory agency. ICRP is not making rules. What ICRP does is proposing recommendations that eventually are adopted by national legislation and translated into law at the national or at the European level, for example. So the recommendations include the definition of the dosimetric variables used in radiation safety, then also the calculation approaches and the computing models used to derive the dosimetric variables, and the dosimetric limits, obviously for staff or public, not for the patient, as you know. Then this is done according to the advance of knowledge on radiation effects and explains why it's varying in the time. So not every year, but we are living under some remain of the ICRP 26 recommendation from 1977 and still applied in some parts of the United States. Then the ICRP 60 published in 1991 is still widely used all over the world, including Europe. And the new recommendation, ICRP 103, that are the most recent one, have been published in 2007, and we will see why they are not fully used in nuclear medicine dosimetry. So first, as I said, dosimetric variable, computing model, computing mode, and we're not going to discuss anything about the threshold and the absorbed dose dosimetric limits. So dosimetric variable, there's one that everybody knows, it's the absorbed dose. So I'm going very quickly here. It's for radiation type R and tissue T. It's a physics variable. It was never meant to give any idea of the effect of radiation. It's just a physics variable. It's an objective measure of the irradiation delivered. It's expressed in gray. 1 gray is 1 joule per kilogram, and it's a non-stochastic parameter, so meaning an average value. Then the equivalent dose takes into account the fact that the being irradiated by different radiation type may not end up in the same damage or in the same detriment. So we are moving away from just the physical quantity of energy absorbed per unit mass, and we multiply by a weighting factor that gives that the fact that, for example, 1 gray of alpha does not make the same damage as 1 gray of photons. It's expressed in sievert, and even if the sievert is also 1 joule per kilogram, it's just a differentiation that is being made so that everybody understands that it's no longer a physical variable, but we're going in direction of an estimate of a detriment. So this is a picture which I quite like about the description of the equivalent dose. It's not the same to receive 1 kilogram of sand or 1 kilogram of stone, but it's still 1 kilogram. So that's exactly the point. So radiation weighting factors are not changing much in time. So these are the latest. And for nuclear medicine, it's very important to see that the radiation weighting factors, the radiation types that we're using, that is mostly gamma and X-ray, beta, electrons, have got a radiation weighting factor of 1. So the only exception would be alpha particle, with a radiation weighting factor of 20, but we're not going to discuss that. Then the effective dose. The effective dose is moving one step further by acknowledging the fact that 1 gray on the knees or 1 gray in the foot is not the same as 1 gray in the eyes. So there is the introduction of a radiation weighting factor that describes the sensitivity and the potential effect of radiation when they are delivered to different tissues. So it's also expressed in sieverts. And here you've got a table that shows the evolution of radiation weighting factor in time. So according to ICRP 26, 60, 103. So I'd like to drag your attention in two directions. First, for example, see the lungs. The radiation weighting factor has not evolved much in time, meaning that the damage induced by radiation received by the lung is known and has been known as not changing much in time. Then take the breast. Radiation weighting factor has decreased a lot in ICRP 60, but it has increased again in ICRP 103 from the knowledge that was acquired from the spread of mammography and the damage potential of the too important number of mammography. I think one of the most interesting variation in tissue weighting factor is that of ovaries and testes, starting from 0.25, so the highest weighting factor of all tissues, to 0.20 to 0.08 in the latest ICRP recommendation. And that is due to the evolution of a knowledge of radiation effects and the fact that the hereditary effects have been overestimated in time. And so that explains why the irradiation of ovaries and testes is now considered as less detrimental as in the past. The only thing to get in mind is that radiation weighting factor evolved in time as a function of a knowledge we have of the effect of radiation. Here you have a summary which shows you how you pass from absorbed dose to equivalent dose and from equivalent dose to effective dose. So nuclear medicine dosimetry, how do we compute the absorbed dose? We saw that in the first lecture. According to the Merck formalism, the absorbed dose to a target is a consequence of a sum of the irradiation from the different sources. So you have to multiply for every source of radiation the cumulated activity in the source H, which is just the number of decay occurring in that source, by the S value from source to target that say how much of the emitted energy in the source is actually absorbed in the target divided by unit mass. So this Merck formalism splits the calculation in 3 steps. Cumulative activity assessment is 2 independent steps, quantitative imaging and calculation of cumulated activity. And we'll see that more in detail in the next lecture on patient-specific dosimetry. And then calculation of S factor, of selection of S factor if you don't compute it, but get it from tables. So the 2 broad approaches of clinical dosimetry are either model-based or patient-specific. And they are here represented as function of speed and accuracy. It is clear that if you are going in direction of model-based dosimetry, it's going to be a fast computation because you'll get S from pre-computed tables. And so you have a very quick or fast idea of the irradiation delivered. Then it may not be, it will not be, it's not, it may not, it will not be the irradiation delivered to your patient. It will be a radiation delivered to a model. If you really want to implement patient-specific dosimetry, then you will increase the accuracy in the assessment of the absorbed dose. But there is a price to pay, and it's going to be that you have to implement more refined methodologies, and therefore the cost in time is going to be important. So these 2 broad approaches could be defined as model-based is essentially diagnostic dosimetry, and patient-specific dosimetry is essentially therapeutic nuclear medicine dosimetry. And we'll come back to that later. And we're going to carry on discussing model-based dosimetry. So how to compute the absorbed dose is how to derive accumulated activity and how to get the S value. According to ICRP recommendations for diagnostic, the cumulated activity is obtained from healthy volunteers for diagnostic traces from a small group of patients, or sometimes extrapolated from animal measurements. Then all these pharmacokinetic data are pooled together. So it is not obtained from one individual, but just it's an average on several individuals to have an idea of the pharmacokinetic, the reference pharmacokinetic of the radiopharmaceutical. And so you've got the curves for all the organs that uptake the product. You've got the time activity curve, and you can integrate them to get the cumulated activity. Then that cumulated activity is obtained using quantitative imaging, using different means. And so one can question the quality of a pharmacokinetic data. And in that interesting article published by Eberlein and colleagues, it's interesting. It's a review of how the biokinetic and the dosimetry, but mostly the biokinetic, was obtained for most diagnostic radiopharmaceutical. And one very important point is basically the oldest, the radiopharmaceutical, and the poorest, the quality of the data, of the pharmacokinetic data, which is understandable because it was obtained with a methodology available at the time. So for example, SPECT-based, SPECT radiopharmaceutical are usually older because PET is more recent. And so all the quantitative information was obtained using, you can see here sometimes planar acquisition and not 3D SPECT quantitative imaging. Sometimes the number of reference is very limited, as is the case here for thallium chloride. And you can see that the degree of confidence that you can have in pharmacokinetic obtained in that context is very low. In other words, the ice on which we are walking is very thin. Obviously, and that's, however, if you see the more recent radiopharmaceutical like PET tracers, and obviously the star here is FDG. So if you see all the several studies that were used to derive the reference pharmacokinetic for FDG that is being used as a reference in ICRP reports, you can see that there's, first of all, a lot of references, and second, that they are more recent and probably much more accurate with the number of acquisition and correction that were implemented. So as a summary, the quality of pharmacokinetic data on which absorbed dose estimates are based tend to improve with time. And this was how to get the cumulated activity. Then the S value, so because this is model-based dosimetry, is obtained from models. Initially, the models were mathematical models defined with equation. So you can see top left, the Snyder and Eckermann hermaphrodites phantom model, the first published in 1975. And then at the bottom left, you see the Christie and Eckermann series with 6 models varying from newborn to adult male. And then to the right, a more recent representation of a pregnant female, adult female, published by Mike Sabin in 1995. So as a summary, all the data coming from pharmacokinetics, so it's an average pharmacokinetics, is input in one reference model to get traceability of the results. But obviously the models vary in time. So if we're coming back in the 1950s, the first model to represent human was a sphere. Then there was the appearance of the Mudd or Oak Ridge National Laboratory models. It was mathematical models in the 1980s. Then more recently, the ICRU and ICRP have published in ICRP report 110 voxel-based adult models. And we're going in direction of hybrid models, where hybrid is a way to generate models of variable size, variable weight, variable body shape, and to end up with voxel at the end. So it means that we have a possibility, thanks to the increasing computing power, to generate models for different morphology, if we wish. Actually, some people have been also presenting more recently, ethnic models, so like Brazilian or Japanese or Korean, Chinese, etc. So the evolution of model is going from the models presented by Snyder or Christie and Eckermann and Sabin in direction, and these are the characteristics of these models. So you can see that, newborn, 1 year old. So this is the Christian Eckermann series. Just notice that the 15-year-old male was considered equivalent to the adult female at the time, just for the morphology. But I think that nowadays this would not be accepted. And these are the models that were used to generate S values that are, for example, present in software photodosimetry like MURDOS for the oldest of you, and Olinda, which has been used, is still being used these days. Then the pregnant woman dosimetry, so as I said, was established from models designed by Stabin in 1995, based on reference model and the woman at 3 stages of pregnancy, 3, 6, and 9 months. So what is represented to the right is a 9-month model. And these are the values. So you can see here from the size and the whole body weight that this is coming initially from the 15-year-old model of Christian Eckermann, but then was included was fetus, fetal soft tissue, fetal skeleton, placenta, so obviously after 6 months and 9 months of pregnancy. And so that allowed to derive calculation of absorbed dose delivered, absorbed dose estimate to embryo fetus per unit activity of radiopharmaceutical for different products, like you can see here, FDG. So you get information on the web references that is cited here. And I must say that even though the web pages have not been updated recently, there's still a lot of good information on this RADAR website. Then evolution of the models. We're now having reference adults that are voxel-based model. So you can see to the left, the adult male and female reference adult. Then a pediatric series that was recently published by ICRP in its report 143, where there is in fact a series of, I think it's 10 models, in fact. 10 models, 5 male and 5 female models at different age. And then there's a pregnant woman that has been not published, not endorsed by ICRP, but has been published. As you can see, we have much more refined model of women at different stages of pregnancy that are available for imaging or calculation, absorbed dose calculations. So what is the evolution of models as a function of the recommendations? We mentioned that ICRP recommendations were published in 1977, 1991, and 2007 as ICRP 26, 60, and 103. In fact, in the recommendation, there is a mention of the models that should be used for absorbed dose calculation. So ICRP 26 recommends using the model proposed by Snyder in 1975. Then ICRP 60 recommend using the models from Christian Eckermann in 1987. And ICRP 103 recommends using the model published as ICRP 110 in 2009. It's actually interesting to note that ICRP 103 recommends using models that were not published at the time ICRP 103 was published. So you have to be very careful because the calculation models evolve in time. So whenever you see some results, some dosimetry results, you really have to be able to understand or to describe to patient or to public what model has been used to do the calculation and which ICRP recommendation it's based on. So if we're looking at the quality of model data, there's obviously an improvement when you pass from model-based models, as was recommended in ICRP 60, to voxel-based model, as is now recommended starting from ICRP 103. We can see from this slice on the abdomen that this really is a better, ICRP 103 voxel-based is a much better description of human anatomy as what is described by just equations. And then this is what it's being used for. In fact, ICRP is publishing reports of absorbed dose delivered to patient from radiopharmaceutical. The first of them was published as ICRP 53 in 1988. Then came addenda, in fact, 1, 2, 3, ICRP 62, 80, 106. And then more recently, ICRP 128 tried to summarize, so group all these reports into one. So basically, if you have only one, it should be that one. But you have to be careful, not every radiopharmaceutical is listed in that report. But again, I mean, I would advise everyone working in nuclear medicine to have at least that ICRP publication. What the ICRP publication gives, and that's what we've seen in the first lecture, is a table of absorbed dose delivered in milligray per megabecq of activity administered to the patient. And more importantly, you have the effective dose and the reference. And I believe that this is the most important. You've got the ICRP 80. So this is based on the or listed in ICRP 80, page 73. So if I'm going backward, I can see that this has been published according to some recommendation or complying with some recommendation. And which one? You can see it here. ICRP 53, so the report on absorbed doses, was in fact computed according to ICRP 26. Then ICRP 62, 80, 106, and even ICRP 128 provide data that were computed according to ICRP 60 recommendations. That is very important, right? Because ICRP 60 is the Christie and Eckermann series. So all these values are obtained using mathematical models and not voxel-based models. Why? It's very interesting because ICRP 103 has been published in 2007, and yet reports published after that, 2008, 2015, still mention, are still computed according to ICRP 60. And this is important because, again, recommendation, condition, the weighting factor, calculation models, and calculation modes. So as a summary, because this is becoming quite complex, we have recommendation, ICRP 26, 60, 103. They define the variable, absorbed dose, the effective dose, etc., the dosimetric approach and the models being used and the weighting factors. Then based on these recommendations, you have ICRP reports, 53, 62, 80, 106, 128, that give practical table for use in diagnostic nuclear medicine. And this is what it's based on. So ICRP 53 is based on ICRP 26, and the others are all based on ICRP 60. In fact, what has changed? From ICRP 26 to ICRP 60, the dosimetric values have changed. ICRP 26 was using effective dose equivalent, is now effective dose, dose equivalent was replaced to equivalent dose, etc. But the models were constant. So these were mathematical models, and they have not changed from ICRP 26 to ICRP 60. So even though the weighting factors change, since the same pharmacokinetics and the same models were used, it was easy to recompute the variables with effective dose, for example, using different weighting factors, but with the same, starting from the same absorbed dose in the tissues. Meaning that the table for most radiopharmaceutical, for example, in ICRP 28, have been computed according to ICRP 60 recommendations. Then ICRP 103 has introduced a lot of changes as compared to ICRP 60. First of all, new models have been introduced, ICRP 110. These are voxel-based adult, male, and female. Second, the calculation mode has changed. What is advised now, according to ICRP 103, is to separate male and female absorbed dose calculation. Then at that level, get the equivalent dose by using radiation weighting factors that are the same for male and female. Then make a sex average equivalent dose and use the same radiation weighting factor for that sex average equivalent dose to get the effective dose for a reference person. And so obviously there are new weighting factors, radiation and hasn't changed much, but tissue weighting factors have changed a little. But then obviously you can see that there is a lot of work to do because first of all, the computation of the absorbed dose has to be made again using the new models. And if it wasn't just that, I mean, the problem is one cannot use a different model and yet considering the same pharmacokinetics for male and female. And therefore, it's not very easy to recompute the absorbed dose separately for men and women and then put that back together. And that explains why data is not available. And so, which means that if you have a new radiopharmaceutical and you have to put that on the market, it's not trivial to follow the recommendation of ICRP 103. And that explains why ICRP report published as report 128 in 2015 is still using, in fact, complying with ICRP 60. And as is stated just here and in the front page, the coefficient tabulated in this publication, ICRP 128, will be superseded in due course by value calculated using the new ICRP recommendations. Okay, so what is published at this moment in ICRP publication 128 is obtained according to ICRP 60 recommendations. Does it mean that we have no data using the new models? No, we have some data. Some have been published. So you have here a paper by the team Martin Anderson in EG and MMI physics. There's been an addendum on this. There's been an erratum, but some values have been published using these new phantoms and models. More recently, specific absorbed fraction for reference adults were published in ICRP publication 133. So it's not S values, but it's SAF, so specific absorbed fraction, meaning that if you know what you're doing, if you know which data to use with the isotope, you can compute S values if you wish. And most of all, and I think it's very important, there's a software that is freely available called IDAC-DOS 2.1 that was presented in 2017 that allowed to do the absorbed dose calculation a little like Olinda, for those who know Olinda, by just putting the residence time in the different sources. And it allows you to compute the absorbed dose in either ICRP 60 or ICRP 103 recommended models. So you can have the absorbed dose for mathematical models or for voxel-based model, only for adults, but it's better than nothing. Pediatric data. Well, it has to be said that the pediatric models, so the geometry, was only recently published, last year in 2020. So the SAF are being computed and verified, but not available yet. They will be available soon. So implementing the MERD scheme in a diagnostic context can be summarized in this table. When you compute the absorbed dose from in target K from source H, you have to use accumulated activity in the source H that is taken from a group of patients, a group of healthy volunteers or extrapolated from animals, but it's a reference pharmacokinetic. Then you have to use S value from a reference model, meaning that the dosimetry is model-based. So this is what is used for new radiopharmaceutical to document the radiation delivered in diagnostic nuclear medicine. So as a conclusion, model-based dosimetry is designed mostly for diagnostics. It's more complicated than expected. To be honest, when I started looking at the different ICRP recommendation, ICRP reports, etc., it took a while to have all the pieces click together to have a clear idea. The thing is, as a physicist or as a nuclear medicine physician, one is in charge of explaining that to public or patients. So it means that it is crucial to be able to tell, these are the data I'm using and this is where it's coming from, or this is how it's been calculated. What is striking is it's also an evolving field where new data, new concept, new recommendations are being published, which explains why the latest ICRP recommendations are not easy to implement in clinical practice, but it's changing and it's coming. With that, I'd like to thank you. And this was the end of, this was the second lecture and generated under the IAA Technical Cooperation Program with Project POL 9025. Goodbye.